Okay. However, what Freire does, and I love his writing style because he introduces, he does this time and time again, and this is more of a sort of analysis of his sort of logical writing style, which I think it's not really part of this discussion, but just a side note. He introduces the assumptions, but immediately after the assumptions, he tells you what he thinks his interpretation of the proper mode of understanding this idea of marginalization, right? So now that we understand this idea of marginalization and we recognize what the assumptions are, what we're going to do is we're going to look at what I've labeled the truth behind marginalization, right? So the truth behind so the truth behind marginalization. The first point of interest is that the oppressed are not marginalized. And this is a quote, right? The oppressed are not marginalized. That's a direct quote from Freire. The oppressed are not marginalized. That sounds so wrong. I love Freire, but it just sounds so wrong, right? And I know what he's saying, and I'll explain it in a second, but even when I say it, for me, this sentence really only has significance in a very, very sort of deep understanding of Freire's pedagogy of the oppressed, because in any other circumstances, it sounds like, no, the oppressed are marginalized. What does he mean by the oppressed are not marginalized? And I'll actually write it down, right? I think that's the exact quote, right? The oppressed are not marginalized. Right? How does he get away with saying the oppressed are not marginalized? The question is Freire, what do you mean? It's obvious that the oppressed are marginalized, right? They're oppressed and they're marginalized. They're not inside society, they're out there. They are out there. They're not in here with us. How do you do that? Well, the first thing that he says to sort of justify this claim, the first thing that he says, if you will, is that there is no out there. Right? He categorically denies the out there. Right? So Freire denies there is no out there. There is nothing outside of our society. If we're talking about members of a community that are allegedly living within our society, right? The oppressed for Freire are and reside within society, right? I erased it. But all that we have is the oppressor and the oppressed, all living within society. It is not like this, right? He denies this. A-F-F-I-R-M. Right? Wrong, right. Right? For Freire, this statement, the oppressed are not marginalized, is because the idea of marginalization assumes, remember, one of the assumptions, that there is an out there, right? That there is an out there. The oppressor is within society, the oppressed are outside of society, which would make sense to say that the oppressed are marginalized. He denies this claim because the oppressor and the oppressed live within the same society, right? It's conceptually, and I mean, I could really spend a lot of time on this, but I'm not, because it would just get way too deep, but you could really, there's a lot of meat in this claim, right? To keep it simple, it's easier, it's far easier, right? I would have viewed Freire's attempt to describe this as a scapegoat. Conceptually, theoretically, it's easier to argue for the dehumanization of members of a community outside of your own community, right? Oh, well, you know, they're not part of my community, they're not part of my society, so it's easy to demonize them, it's easy to dehumanize them, it's easy to depersonalize them, right? Conceptually, you can create that argument rather simply. It's not that easy, it's not that difficult of a conceptual task as a writer, Freire as a writer trying to, you know, write the book. Far more difficult for him is to give an account of how the oppressor oppresses the oppressed within society. This is a more difficult state of affairs to describe than this. This state of affairs is easier to describe. This state of affairs is harder to describe, but he describes the harder state of affairs because he thinks, and I agree with him, that this is correct and this is false, right? There is no out there. Those people who we oppress within our society. And they've always been part of our society. But we've created this mythical state of affairs where they're out there, and it's through our generosity and our paternalism that we introduce them into our society, and we enforce the assimilation of them so that they are more like us. And this is exactly what he's denying, right? There's a lot more to it, but I think that explains, you get the gist, right? The next point is that they are used as, the oppressed, right? Not in this sense, but in this sense, the oppressed are used as what? Right? They're used, right? I don't want your knowledge, but I want your labor, right, in a social sense. They are used as beings for others, right? You exist only insofar as you make my life better. So, in a student-teacher relationship, the student's existence must be one of ignorance, right? The ontological status, if you will, to be technical, the ontological status of the student for free year is completely embodied in the student's ignorance. Because insofar as the student is ignorant, the student has a huge receptacle waiting for me to deposit knowledge. So the dumber you are, the better it is for me. And at least be quiet, right? Don't raise your hand and just let me deposit this information and you'll be smart like I am, right? That assumption, that idea, looks at the relationship of the student as only existing insofar as you exist because you're waiting for my deposit, right? Your existence is important because it is through your ignorance that I show how generous I am and I show how smart I am. You don't do anything, right? But what I do is I do all of this charity work for you, for your own interest, for your own good, right? It's paternalistic, and it's my way, or quote unquote, the highway, right? What we want to do in in the pedagogy of the oppressed, right, and the transformation of the traditional educational system, is we want to transform the student, the oppressed, into a being for themselves. I become an autonomous agent, and I'm able to sustain my own livelihood through my own acts, through my own means, and I don't need to depend on the generosity, the charity of this sort of omnipotent oppressor.